What's up everybody and welcome to this video in which I will go straight to the point since the title is a little bit weird, is a little bit awkward. I do realize that, but it catches your attention, or doesn't it? So the reason why I bring it up, did Bach play on the clavichord, is because I received a few weeks ago when I was on holiday with my family in North Holland, a comment on the full release of the Bach Partitas I have on YouTube. And I will read it to you and we will address certain points. I've blurred the person's icon and name because I don't think it's meant to be exposed in this way. But we can take some elements and put it in a broader perspective and reflect on that. There are interesting points here to be made. I read it to you. So he writes, or she writes, there is absolutely no evidence Johann Sebastian Bach composed for and played the clavichord. None of them was retrieved in his instrumental collection after his death. Some specialized scholars agreed to think this uncertain legend could have been a mystification from his late biographer Forkel. So there you have it. Before we address certain facts, I wonder why an obvious music lover, and again, it's not about this person, it's about I'm talking in general, because it's not the first time, it will not be the last time. Why an obvious music lover in the early music scene takes the energy to go on a public forum and give a comment as if I wanted to make a statement against, obviously, the harpsichord here, instead of just sharing a version of that music on the instrument I'm passionate about. I was thinking about the reasons, and it's interesting to reflect on that. You know, this early music movement, this historically informed performance practice, let's say the 60s or the 70s as a modern starting point, so it goes back half a century and more, has become perhaps a kind of real movement, structural movement with an own audience. Those things, having an audience for listening to performances on period instrument, is something, of course, the generation of the 50s and the 60s and the 70s have fought for, and now we have it. But a movement needs also to have certain foundations, a shared belief system. And many of the assumptions that the pioneers, as we call them, made, the 60s and the 70 generations, like for instance equal temperament, you don't talk about equal temperament, and certainly not related to Bach. Appoggiaturas, you play them overall short, not long, because the pianist used a long version, we use this short version. For instance, practicing scales is something we don't do anymore, and even it's affecting the classic pianist school who did do that, although in 18th and 19th century, as also early 19th century, they just practiced scales. They had technical exercises. So many of those assumptions in the 60s, 70s were, I don't say always, but based partly on the fact of the desire of opposing to what existed. And that's very strong and that's very important, because if you oppose to something that exists, you create definition, and out of which a group can be formed, in this case an audience. So it's fully understandable, and we should be aware ourselves, me included. I'm try to be aware of that, but it's actually impossible because you live in your time. You can only reflect on yourself later. So I'm now saying things in the moment as I speak to you. But we all, of course, have our perspectives, and we all react on things that we encounter, that we are inspired by or not. And so it's always something that goes back and forth. But some of those foundations that I said to you are very strong for the early music movement and are hard to be touched. So if a newer generation, like for instance, I'm a new generation compared to the 60s and the 70s generations, who created much from scratch, they had actually a great time because the paper was empty and everything they wrote on it was big news. Now today we are hustling and say we are adjusting a little bit here, adjusting a little bit there. But if something big comes up, like for instance, the Bach Partitas, we all knew that Bach composed them for the harpsichord, not for the clavichord. I'm not really saying that you think like that. But in general today, still Bach Partitas on Clavichord, that's something that maybe is not a real cornerstone of the early music movement, but just something that is very close to, because let's be honest, the great musicians have recorded that on harpsichord, not on clavichord. So from the moment then that someone like I upload on YouTube a complete version of all partitas on clavichord, it's kind of touching a little bit of one of those foundations, Bach harpsichord. And so you touch a kind of belief structure, and that, in my opinion, energizes people to take the time and the effort and go to a public forum where they, maybe without realizing, make a comment that's actually besides what the video is about. And so that statement is probably to be seen from that foundational structure, from that belief structure, from that movement that is built on certain cornerstones, and you don't touch them. We should reflect on that, and then I come to the facts of Bach, if Bach played on clavichord or not. We should reflect on that because I think it's important. A movement like the early music movement can only live by the nature of change, reflection, research, and by an audience that applauds changes and new insights. When the early music movement becomes a strong foundation based on cornerstones and on a strong, concrete foundation, it is dangerous because it doesn't move anymore as it should. So that's one of the points I wanted to make clear to you, to reflect on that, and leave me in the comments what you think about this yourself. Would be interested to read. By the way, I've made a video a few months ago. I will link it here in the info cards or in the description. You can click on that if you want to find out more on that, in which I talked about the 3 phases of research any musician in the historical informed performance practice should actually think about of having. Not going to detail, you can see it in that video. So now we come to some facts about Bach and the clavichord. Just before diving into sources directly related to the great master, it would be easier and it would be more safe perhaps to say that Bach lived on the moon instead of early 18th century Saxony, if he never would have played the clavichord. Since that time, there was an abundant presence of the clavichord, and the clavichord was everywhere, in all layers of society. Also, the top elite players, the unfretted clavichord, here, like I'm playing, is developed exactly in the time where Bach lived to play on more remote keys than they did until then. And of course, it was not the baker's wife who might have had also a clavichord who played in C sharp major. That was the handful of top elite players, I would say over the top talented players, who wanted to expand their technique and go beyond to the keys that were accepted and possible and the temperaments that were used back then. So they expanded their technique, and exactly at that time, and actually a little bit before, the clavichord became from a fretted instrument an unfretted instrument. All of that happened in exactly the same time and exact areas where Bach lived, and Bach wouldn't have participated on that evolution, although he wrote his own 24 keys well-tempered clavier. So only from a broader contextual scene, it makes no sense to even doubt the fact that Bach was considering the clavichord as one of his most important keyboard instruments. So we could dive really into detail here, and if you would like to read more about this, and if you would like to know more on the clavichord, there is a wonderful magazine called Clavichord International. I will put links in the description box. It has 2 issues a year with wonderful articles, and as we speak, the second part of Joris Potvliegen, so the builder of my clavichord article on Bach and the clavichord, is to be published as a pre-publication in that magazine. So there you'll find a lot of sources for the first time actually written down with the perspective of with the acceptance that Bach played the clavichord. And by the way, I'm not making the case against the the harpsichord, I'm making the case for the clavichord because that's really necessary. It's one of the most important keyboard instruments of 18th century German-speaking areas, and it's, if we see today's musical scene, it's totally underrepresented as such. And then I come to some details. What is mentioned in this comment is the estate that was made after Bach's death, and of course the biographer Johann Nikolaus Forkel. So concerning the estate, to just focus on that, we have a list of what was present in Bach's after Bach's death. And in that list, there is no direct indication of a clavichord. There are clavecins and spinetchen, so a spinet. And then there is a quote that talks about a draaiklavier nebst pedaal. So the three keyboard, I would say in post-Wanda Landowska English, and a pedal. So what's that? And in that article that Joris Bottliga has written, he pointed out that what the official person is writing down is reflecting the use of terminology as was used in the Bach family, as probably was told to him to write it down like that. So we read clavecin, and we read spinet, and we read clavier. So only from that context, in that document, that the other keyboard types are named specifically with their proper names, clavecin, harpsichord, and spinet, Joris Bottliga assumes that the clavier was the term used within the Bach family for clavichord. So draaiklavier nebst pedaal, there was a discussion within the family, probably because Bach gave them away to Johann Christian Bach while still living. And probably they had some value. So there was a little bit of discussion on that theme, since they were not anymore in the estate of Bach. So draaiklavier nebst pedaal for certainty means 3 clavichords and a pedal. The assumption that he had 3 clavichords and a pedal clavichord, as he had a pedal harpsichord, as we can read in Forkel's biography, probably makes the most sense. Then moving quickly to Forkel, he was active in Göttingen at the university, actually got the degree of professor just based on his services to that and his knowledge and his work. He wrote in his biography in 1802 that Bach played am liebsten am clavichord. So Bach would have liked to play the clavichord the most. And if I read the complete quote, which I have here on paper, then you can easily understand a little bit the agitation amongst today's harpsichord players, which I understand because Forkel is rather harsh on the harpsichord. So Forkel writes he enjoyed Bach foremost to play on the clavichord. The so-called harpsichords, although these likewise allowed for a varied rendering, he thought to be soulless. And the pianofortes during his lifetime were still so much in their first development and much too plump as to suffice him. Therefore he thought the clavichord the best instrument to study as well as altogether for private entertaining. He judged it the most adequate means to express his finest thoughts and could not imagine that on any harpsichord or pianoforte such manifold shadings of tone could be produced as on this, in spite of its poor volume and within its limited capabilities, a very flexible instrument. So that's of course not such a nice comment if you play your whole life harpsichord. And I remember seeing also interviews with Gustav Leonhardt, which I admire really a lot, don't get me wrong on this, where he says that Forkel obviously is not to be trusted. And I just wonder if he would have left out the passage on the harpsichord and just left the positive reflection on the clavichord, it might have had a way more bigger impact than it has today. If you read the letters of C.P.E. Bach, there you'll find, and of course Forkel was in close contact with C.P.E. Bach. He received much of the Bach archive, so that's the private archive of the Bach family, with the scores of Bach to be copied, and he sent them back. So he was also an agent for C.P.E. Bach. So he was much in contact with the Bach family. And so if you read the letters Bach sent to Forkel talking about his father, that is taking over into the biography of Forkel. And if you compare those two sources, you can only say that Forkel was really close to the source, if not copied the letter of Bach exactly into his biography. So what could have been the reason that for that particular passage talking about the clavichord, he was not trustworthy? Only because his view deviates somewhat from our present view. I don't think that's enough to reject an historical source. Closer than Forkel's biography to Johann Sebastian Bach, through his children, Emanuel and Friedemann, we probably will never get any more, for sure, because the time is over. So that's just a final thought on this. It's became a longer video than I planned, but I think it contains a few elements that are really worth considering and reflecting upon. So again, to close this, it's not against any other type of keyboard instruments. I like the performances even on a Steinway piano. I'm a big fan of Glenn Gould. So you know that I'm talking here out of the box in the most relaxed way. I'm making the case strongly for the clavichord, because that we cannot do hard enough. This instrument was on the highest level in 18th century. Most German speaking areas, going from Bach even before, take Pachelbel with that, because I strongly believe Pachelbel played already on an unfretted clavichord. It's hard to think otherwise. And take it way back to young Beethoven, and you have 100 years of music in which the clavichord really served on the highest possible levels. And that should be reflected more in our today musical scene. That's all I've got for you today, guys. So thank you for watching. If this is your first time here on Authentic Sound, I'd love to have you subscribed. Hit also that bell icon next to the subscription button so you stay on top of everything. Also the live streams we're doing. We are upgrading our live stream system. You will see that I've taken a little break because we are working hard on a new website and the release of the Bach Partitas on vinyl and on clavichord. See you next time again. Bye.